This reality could be described as perhaps the largest financial experiment in human history. I'm sure most people are not even aware that they are living inside this reality. Global debt, government debt, corporate debt, household debt, has all grown to levels never seen before in any period of history. Today, governments borrow trillions as if they are borrowing spare change. Central banks create money with a few keystrokes. Families take on 30-year mortgages as if they are doing grocery shopping. When we talk about debt, we speak as if it is normal, harmless, and something that can go on forever, but the truth is more unsettling. Throughout history, debt has always been a tool of power. It has been used like a weapon to maintain control, and it has always stood like a ticking time bomb waiting for a command. We are not asking the real question. Not will this massive debt swamp lead to a crisis? The real question is, if the system resets one day, when will it happen, and who will pay the price? To understand how we got here, we must go back to the roots of debt. Debt is as old as civilization itself. The earliest clay tablets in Mesopotamia date back thousands of years before Christ. And they were not poetry or philosophy, they were records. Who owed how much grain, how many cattle? Back then, debt was not seen as just an economic matter. It was almost sacred. Priests and kings controlled and enforced it, and sometimes, to prevent social collapse, they declared great jubilees and wiped debts clean. Think about that. Thousands of years ago, the idea of resetting the financial system existed to keep society alive. That means even then they understood that debt was power, but too much debt was dangerous. Ancient rulers knew something today's leaders seem to have forgotten. You cannot enslave a population with endless obligations forever. At some point, the system collapses. Now let's move to the Renaissance and look at banking families like the Medici in Florence. Debt was no longer measured in grain or cattle. It was now driven by gold and credit. Kings and popes borrowed vast sums for wars, cathedrals, and empires. Debt always carries risk. Spain is a perfect example. Despite being flooded with silver from the New World, it went bankrupt 4 times in the 16th century. When ambition blinds reality, even gold is not enough. Empires filled with gold can still be crushed under debt. Debt was no longer personal. It became the fuel of geopolitics. It financed wars, toppled dynasties, and redrew maps. In the 20th century, the real explosion of modern debt began. After World War I, national debts had grown so enormous that the question, "How will this be repaid?" had already lost its meaning. Germany was crushed under the burden of reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Economists of the time warned that it would tear the country apart, and they were right. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s, when people carried wheelbarrows full of money just to buy bread, was the direct result of unpayable debt. And the scars of this collapse were deep enough to pave the way for World War II. Debt was never just numbers. It was a harbinger of chaos. Then came Bretton Woods in 1944. The modern financial order was built there. When the war ended, the United States held 2/3 of the world's gold and wrote the rules. The dollar became the anchor currency, convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies were tied to the dollar. It was presented as stability, but in reality it created dependency. Because now the world's debt, bonds, and accounts rested on one promise: that the United States would remain disciplined. This worked for a while, until the 1960s, when the Vietnam War and domestic spending led the U.S. to print more dollars than it had gold. Foreign nations noticed and demanded gold instead of paper. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. The link between the dollar and gold was broken. Debt was now unchained. Governments could borrow and print money limited only by confidence. 1971 was a radical turning point. It removed the limits of debt and made it nearly infinite. With gold gone, central banks began managing economies through interest rates. When growth slowed, they cut rates and encouraged borrowing. When crises hit, they borrowed even more to fill the gaps. Every bailout required even more debt than the last. In the 1980s, under Reagan and Thatcher, public debt surged dramatically. Developing countries borrowed heavily from Western banks, and when they couldn't repay, the Latin American debt crisis erupted. The model was now clear: chase prosperity through debt, and when the tide goes out, drown. Do not think of the 2008 crisis as just a housing crisis. It was a mountain of layered debt, a pyramid of leverage, a system so fragile that when a single piece collapsed, the entire structure shook. Mortgages were packaged, securitized, sold to investors, insured with derivatives, and inflated with leverage ratios of 30-1. The collapse destroyed banks, wiped out pensions, and forced governments into trillion-dollar bailouts. The most painful part was this: those who took reckless risks were saved, while ordinary people were left with unemployment, foreclosures, and austerity. Debt is not neutral. It operates like a system that protects the powerful. Since then, things have moved even further away from reality. Global debt has tripled over the past 20 years, surpassing $300 trillion by 2023. That is nearly 4 times the size of the global economy. Governments, corporations, households, everyone is living on debt. In countries like Japan, public debt exceeds 200% of GDP. The United States adds trillions every year without hesitation. Developing nations borrow in foreign currencies, and when interest rates spike, the risk of collapse rises instantly. The system assumes that this debt can grow forever. But in reality, debt always has a cost. It distorts behavior. It creates bubbles. It transfers wealth from one group to another. Most importantly, it binds future generations. Every dollar borrowed today is a claim on tomorrow's labor. As the numbers grow, repayment becomes harder. That is why history is filled with defaults, restructurings, inflation, and crises. Debt can end in only 3 ways. It is either paid honestly, eroded by inflation, or defaulted on. No empire has ever escaped this reality. Today, these consequences exist everywhere, yet most people do not see them because debt has become invisible. When governments run deficits, they do not knock on your door. They issue bonds, sell them to banks or foreign investors, and quietly write the bill in your name. When you use a credit card, you are not paying, you are borrowing. Companies report record profits, but often these profits are inflated through debt-funded share buybacks. The system grows through leverage, but leverage is like gravity. It feels light on the way up and devastating on the way down. Believe it or not, today's financial system floats on promises that are difficult to keep. Look at the anchor of the global system, the United States. In 2024, its debt exceeded $34 trillion. Interest payments alone are approaching the level of defense spending. In other words, the world's largest power is borrowing more just to pay interest on its existing debt. In Europe, countries like Italy and Greece still live with debt-to-GDP ratios above 100%. In China, the debt explosion is hidden within local governments and state-owned enterprises, meaning it may be far larger than it appears. Debt keeps growing everywhere. Debt benefits politicians because it buys time. Raising taxes angers voters. Cutting spending angers them even more. But borrowing feels painless. This game breaks when interest rates spike, and that is exactly what has been happening since 2022. Debt is like a sleeping predator, harmless while asleep, deadly when it awakens. Despite all this, debt is still sold as the path to prosperity. Students are told, take loans and study. Families are told, buy a house at any cost, it will always go up. Nations are told deficits do not matter because central banks can print money. The biggest lie of modern finance is that debt is free, infinite, and safe. History screams the opposite. When debt grows too large, there is no easy escape. Restructuring, inflation, or default. So where is this heading? The signs point to inflation, and ordinary people will pay the price. Savings will erode, wages will fail to keep up, and purchasing power will decline. It is the oldest trick in the book, yet people still fall for it because inflation is subtle. The numbers are abstract, and the problem feels like someone else's. The final truth is this: debt is not just economics, it is power. Who lends? Who borrows? Who gets rescued when collapse comes? The system is designed so that when debt becomes unbearable, those in power rarely pay. Banks are bailed out, corporations are restructured, politicians retire, ordinary people lose their homes, their jobs, their hopes. That is why understanding debt is not just financial literacy, it is survival. Pull back the curtain, see the pattern in history. Protect yourself, because the system will repeat this cycle. Debt will grow, leaders will deny, crisis will erupt, society will reset. Make your choice. Will you live through this cycle blindly or consciously? Global debt is not just numbers. It is a massive cloud casting a shadow over our future.